Howdy Smyth Ute builders, Hesty here coming to you with a water management discussion and some demonstrations. I'm going to try to be concise, but there is a ton of stuff to cover about water management. And I call it water management because you can't waterproof. It really, water is going to get in there, so you have to give it a place to go. Just like with landscaping, water's going to go how it wants to go. So you set it up where you want it to go. And I'm kind of taking the same approach with this. And that's why I call it water management. Somebody give me a better term and I'll use that next one. So the primary is the floor to the bed wall. There's also the rear window. And I'm sorry, let me back up. Jetta, both Mark IV and Mark V, Beetle, and Audi. I know this applies to those 4 kits. The Beetle, there's some exceptions, and you may have seen it if you watched any of my other videos. I will, as we're going through and we get into the mechanics of it, I'll try to describe some of the exceptions to the Beetle kit. But without getting into the weeds now, it will apply to all those 4 kits. If you have a different kit, I'm sorry, I just don't know if it applies or not. So please watch if you're interested, you're welcome. Another disclaimer is we have a huge variety of experience and knowledge. So I don't mean to insult anybody with some very simplistic stuff, but some guys that don't have that much experience about it, haven't built a car before, so I'm trying to include tips for them too. So I'm trying to cover it all. It makes it a big long video, but bear with me, and I think I will have some points that will be useful for everybody. If not, I'm sorry for wasting your time. Okay, back to water management. So the main thing, as I mentioned, is that front bed wall, and then the second is the window. Not going to address the window, either style of window in this video. This is seam sealing, forward bed wall sealing, dealing with water under the bed. And you're going to get water under the bed, so it's best to prepare for it. So treat everything as if it's exposed to the elements. All of your cut edges, treat those well. That's a little bit off subject, but back to seam sealing. So for example, because this is a Mark V I'm in the middle of, and I'm going to kind of use this as a training aid, as a prop here. So even though I bonded the B-pillar to the car's B-pillar, the B-pillar brace to the B-pillar of the car, I still go back and seam seal it, at least on the outside. Now I used 3M panel bond in that seam, gooped it up, and then riveted it on. So that is about as the best attachment you're ever going to get, and hopefully it'll never have to come off, because it'll be a nightmare. You'll ruin the car trying to get that off. But you still get moisture seepage. So I went ahead and seam sealed it. First step, recommendation is all of your seams, even if it's not a water issue area or whatever, seam seal it. It'll cost you an extra $30 over the entire build, maybe. It'll be worth it in the long run, I believe. It also will help dampen rattles. Okay, so some of the stuff that I'm going to use, and I'm going to talk about it, and then as I'm running through everything else, you'll understand. You'll see me build some stuff out of this aluminum. I believe this is 22 gauge. Big box store, Lowe's, Home Depot, Ace, True Value. I like to try to shop at the small guys if I can. This is the kind of aluminum that they make sunrooms out of. So it's usually in the screen area with screens. Pretty cheap. You get a humongous roll of it. It's $40. That's way more than you ever need, but you can also buy smaller pieces of it. I do enough that I just get the 40-foot roll and just hack pieces off. And it's also really useful to have around for making flashings and other stuff. It is aluminum, and it is an epoxy coat, so it's pretty weather resistant stuff. I don't really do anything with this to make it more, to more seal it, other than edge sealing. So we're going to use some of that in my examples. I'll show you a couple of things I do with that. There are other materials, and you could use steel to do the same thing. You could use sheet steel. You could even use, for example, a piece of the roof that you cut off a little bit harder to work with, and this will rust. So it'll take more treatment. Once you get it formed and drilled and everything you need to do to get it to fit where you want it, you're gonna have to treat it, paint it, seal it, do something with it so that it doesn't rust. So that's one reason that I default to the aluminum. We're going to talk about expanding foam. There are multiples of expanding foam. My experience of expanding foam comes from the boat and jet ski industry. So I default to marine grade type stuff. Try not to bore you with a ton of details, but what I like to use, my favorite, is the 2-pound version, and I just happen to get mine from US Composites. They're in South Florida, so it comes quick. There's another place in the California Bay Area, Tap Plastics, and you can order online, and I believe they have different versions of this, but it's called pour foam, expanding foam, 2-part foam. There's a lot of different names for it. It comes in different weights, 2 pound, 4 pound, 8 pound, 16 pound. There might be one higher than that. That refers to the density, and I believe that's a PSI for like when it's cured, how many pounds it'll take. Coast Guard has requirements for how heavy duty foam that you use in different parts of a boat, if it's structural, if it's water sealing, if it's flotation, etc. 2 pound meets the flotation, not necessarily the construction, the rigidity, if it's structural. So like when I fill a jet ski, I use 4 pound. But for all this, my personal belief is 2 pound is going to be plenty. And as you increase your poundage, your yield goes down. So you got to buy more foam. I believe this is the smallest they offer, and this is $40 for the 2 parts in the kit. This will do at least 2 cars. So, 2 pound foam is the cheapest they have, the smallest they have it. You're going to pay $40 for it. Another alternative is the expanding foam like you use in construction that you buy in the aerosol can, Home Depot, Lowe's, etc. I'm not a big fan of it. I've used it plenty. I use it in construction, building, putting the shop up. I sealed everything with that, particularly where wires go through the wall, etc. But for our application here, I'm not a fan of it. If you are going to use it, it's a little more expensive. Still cheaper than this is the black pond. It's pond foam, but it's the same stuff that you're used to. The yellow expanding foam. I'm drawing a blank on the really common name for it. $6 or $7 a can, and then you can get different kinds of nozzles, and they have there's 8 different kinds when you go big gap filler, small gap filler, etc. Fireproof is another version, blah blah blah. Point being, they have a version that the foam actually comes out black, and it's the lid on. Sorry, I don't have any. The lid on it is black, and it's supposedly waterproof. So my point is, we're expecting exposure to water. We're fighting water, so I would recommend using the that moisture, the black stuff, if you're going to use the big box store type expanding foam. Another piece on foam while we're here is there's a difference between whether you've cut it or not. So this is the 2 pound that I was just talking about that I poured last night. And I don't know if you can tell in the lighting here, but it skims over as it expands and cures. So this is a very waterproof surface. Now, if you trim it back and cut it, it's porous. So now it's more likely to absorb water. You can coat it, you can paint it, but it's got to be a very heavy paint. You could use something like bed liner or undercoat, or just several coats of paint. You could use something like Flex Seal. It makes it's kind of a silicone base. That stuff actually, for the infomercials, yeah, but I actually like that stuff. So if you do find yourself trimming it back, I recommend coating that next with something. So where you don't have to, just leave it and let it skin over. All right, I'm going too long. So let me try to knock through this. You're probably familiar with the panel bond. I love this stuff. I overuse it. It's unnecessary to use it as much as I do, but I'll show you where I put it. So panel bond, great stuff. Not necessarily a waterproof type seal. I would still seam seal any seams that you put this on, but I will mention it as we're going. My personal favorite for seam sealing is the Sikaflex construction sealant. That's kind of my go-to. You can also get seam sealer. Seam sealer has a limited shelf life. Well, this does too, but the automotive grade seam sealer, I get mine at Napa, but you can get it at other auto parts stores. It's a little more expensive. This is $8 or so a tube, $7 or $8. The seam sealer is 15 or 16 bucks a tube. Some of it is even more expensive. It's great stuff, but more expensive, shorter shelf life. It's 2 or 3 months, an unopened tube. So I tend not to keep it around, and if I do have a tube, by the time I get to it, it's often gooped up and starting to cure, so it goes in the trash. So I default to this one. You'll hear Mark talk about window urethane or window weld. There's two that you commonly see from 3M, and I love them both. One is actually called window weld, no W on the window. That's my favorite. It's fast cure. You put it in place. It's what they glue your windshield in with. Fantastic stuff. This is very, very similar, half as much, and takes a little bit longer to cure. So, for example, with a windshield, you got to tape it in place so it doesn't start sliding down. But for our purposes, like gluing in the rear window on the sliding window kits, not the Beetle, it's a different window seal there. And you can use this as a seam sealer. And also on the bodywork. I've talked about that in bodywork, but this is the little bit cheaper one. I believe it's 20 bucks a tube. Don't quote me though, but a little bit cheaper than the window weld. Normally I get the window weld, but sometimes I'll use this too. They're almost perfectly interchangeable, and you wouldn't even recognize the difference as you're going. Mark loves this stuff. I love it too, but for specific applications, and I generally don't use it for waterproofing except sealing the window in. And the other, okay, I rewind. I love this stuff for putting on the rail caps. That's what I use to glue on rail caps. Okay. One of my favorites from the marine, from boat and jet ski stuff is 3M 5200. This stuff is considered permanent. It is awesome. I love this stuff. It is gonna seal. If you prep that surface right, this is gonna seal, and it's gonna stay sealed. It's for use below the waterline on boats. It is a sealant, not necessarily an adhesive, but I use it as an adhesive sometimes for a lower shear strength application. But I'm talking about it as a sealant in this in our use here. Love this stuff. A little bit expensive, and it takes a long time to cure. There are 2 grades. High strength. Okay, so it says right on the tube, cures in 7 days. Now the problem with that is, on a vertical surface, it starts to droop. So you fill your gap beautifully, and 3 days later, it sags. And it sags out, and now it's open. So it's a little bit tricky. There is a fast cure version of this. I much prefer that, and if you're gonna use 3M 5200, I highly recommend the fast cure. I don't think it's necessary in this application, but it sucks to build this beautiful vehicle, and then the first time it rains, it stinks inside because water got into the carpet, and the underlayment really is what gets so smelly. And you have a wonderful car that's useless in the rain. That is just wrong. So I spend a lot of time making sure that's watertight before I put it all together. So it may be worth it. Up to you. I'm just trying to give you some options here. Another thing we're going to use is a long knife for the foam. And that concludes my materials list. There'll be some other things, some rivets and some hose and some through hole fittings and stuff like that, but we'll talk about those as we get to it. So the first point I want to bring out is specific difference between the Jetta and Audi and the Beetle kits. And the difference is the bed, how you put the bed in. So on the Beetle kit, it works fantastic to assemble that bed off the car and then put it on the car. But that changes some things about how you seal things. You can use that technique on the Jettas, both the Mark IV, Mark V, excuse me, and on the Audi, but it's a little more difficult. I've done them both ways now, and I actually prefer. I love building the Beetle, building that box, making sure it's square. You can leave it sitting on your bench or whatever for 3 days before you put it on the car. I love that technique. I just can't master it the same way and it boils down to this B-pillar brace. You got to put this B-pillar brace on the car first on its own. That's your first step, really, once you get the car cut and maybe get your wiring done. And then putting that bed in, I end up messing stuff up. Here's my exception. Smyth Performance, Mark Smith's instructions for building the Beetle kit is to fully assemble that bed off the car and then walk it up onto the car. Works great, but that presents a problem now trying to seal this forward bed wall with that front floor panel in. So the technique that I've been using, and it's not official, it's just me coming up with different ways to try to do stuff, is I leave that out. I assemble the bed with everything except that forward wall. I sometimes will loosely bolt it in just to help me get the square, but then I take it out. And that way, when I set that bed into the car, I can get at that front seam and I'm not laying on the floor pan, and reaching up and trying to seal. I can't get a good seal that way. It is a bit of a pain to put that forward bed panel into the Beetle kit when you have the rest of it all built. You can crimp it a little bit and stuff. If you are worried about scoring up the inside of your bed wall because you like that pristine aluminum, that might not be the way you want to go because it's really difficult not to. I've tried, putting a towel or a little piece of tag board or piece of paper or something and then kind of tapping it down into place. Every time I end up scoring it. But I usually coat my bed, so I'm not too worried about it, a bed liner type, and that covers any scratches. You can polish them out, but then you're creating more work for yourself. But I will default back to sealing this car is one of the most important things, because if it leaks, nobody wants a car that leaks. You don't want it, and you can't sell it. So, and I know of 2 kits that the owner sold them because they couldn't figure out how to get them sealed. That's you kind of get my priority now. All right, so I'm going to take the camera off the stand and talk from behind the camera and try to talk through some of the steps of how I do all this and the materials that I'm using to do it. So coming into the car, and now we're looking at what used to be the seat pan. This area here, there's your, depending on your car, whether it's a fuel pump, but there is a fuel sender and everything in that cavity, right? And the fuel tank is right underneath this. So another caution, if you're gonna drill through this, you gotta make sure you're not hitting the tank because it's very close. And for example, here is one of the drains that you pop, right? So that this area can drain. And that black surface that's immediately through that hole, that's the top of the fuel tank. So that's the gap you have to work with. So as you're drilling, particularly back a little bit, apologize for the mess, but as you're putting these floor brackets in, you're close to the tank. So limit your drill bit so that if it grabs, it doesn't shoot down into the tank. The tank is just polyethylene. It's a plastic fuel tank, so it drills very easily, and don't get yourself into that problem. Okay, but I'm getting off subject again. Here we are. Here's the forward bed wall and, of course, the seat pan. So when you first strip the car, you'll notice there's holes all along here. You got to seal those holes, and you can do that before you even start construction, to include where the leads to your fuel pump fuel sender. There's this little tab that clips in, right? And that clips into a hole that I have since then sealed. You got to pull that out and seal all that. That leads directly back into the car. And you look at this, and this area here is, I don't know, roughly 3 inches lower than that, but you will be surprised at how much moisture will find its way up that 3-inch hill to get to this area. So take my word for it. That's why we're going to seal all this stuff. Okay, so those holes, I'm going to look into the car now. Here's the front bed wall, right? Those holes lead to here. So that's why we've got to seal the holes in the bed. All right, if you seal them in the cab, then the problem you're going to run into is eventually water will get in from the bedside, and if it's sealed here, the water will sit right there and it'll rust out your car right here. So bad idea to only seal this side. I recommend leaving it open in the car and sealing it in the bed, what has now become the bed. Okay, so that's my step one, is to make sure you get all those sealed, and if they have a plastic clip in them, take that plastic clip out and make sure you get it sealed. Some of them are small enough that you can just take sealer and make a dab on there and smear it around and seal it. Others are too big, so I cut myself a strip of that aluminum, and you could use plastic, you could weld steel. There's 100 different ways to do it. My technique is I just cut little rectangles of this aluminum, that same aluminum I was talking about in the intro, and seal it over those holes and then put sealant on top of that. Now, one more piece to this that sounds paranoid, but you just got to trust me, because I ran into it on a car and it kicked my butt and the car leaked and it took me forever to figure out and fix it. So this corner, what used to be the forward edge of this rear seat, is spot welded onto this piece of the car here. So that whole seam all along here is actually open, just like those holes are open into that same cavity. So it doesn't take but a couple extra minutes. I run that seam sealer all the way along there, particularly here above the cover to the fuel tank. That is normally where I see the gap. So seam seal that. Okay. So that is that first step. The second step is when you put this front bed wall in. However, whether you're doing it as the whole bed is assembled, whether you're doing it as the whole bed assembled or you're doing it individually. I have done it both ways, right, between the Beetle and the Jetta. I like to leave that loose, get the bed set right where, or the front wall set right where you want it. Mark it off, maybe even put in a couple of the bolts on the side so it's holding it and you can replicate exactly where it came from. Go through and drill the rivets that are on the forward side down towards the bottom, down along that edge, right? I drill those rivets, then I push that wall maybe a ½ inch forward. You can put a little block or something in it to hold it. Get out my gun and run seam sealer all the way across, and I put plenty in there because I want it to ooze out on both sides. And then come back and pop all those rivets in. Once the rivets are in, I go back and smear that sealant around a little bit on both sides, on the inside of the car and on the outside. And so now I've got a really nice seal. So water will not, if it's up against this front bed wall, whether it's draining from the bed floor or it's collected in here and I'm parked downhill or driving downhill, if water runs up there, I'm confident that it's not going to come through that seam, this seam, or one of those holes. All right. Step, what are we on? 3 here, is I make, out of that aluminum, I make these little panels. You could just foam this, and I've done that on cars before, and then been worried about the foam being exposed to water. So my preference is spend the extra hour and a half and make these aluminum panels. So you can see it fits pretty well on that flange. It's contoured to match the floor, and then I leave a tab that sticks in towards the center of the car because that corner is a problem corner. Without treatment, any water that ends up here drains out to the side, drains into that side panel. If we come out, look, and now I've filled it with foam so you can't see, but it drains into this cavity, and that cavity is sloped downhill, and so it will either sit up against that wall if you've sealed it really well, or if you haven't, it ends up in the car. Either way, it's bad. So that's why I build these little panels. They don't have to be a perfect fit. You can seam seal, you know, up to 1/4, maybe 3/8 inch, as long as you have some places that contact. I make them a little bit long, and from the upper view here, I think you'll be able to see my contour. And let me move that piece of foam. Okay, so you can see here it has a little bit of contour. That's fine. And here that tab is folded up to cover that little triangular corner here that becomes a problem. Now, it would have been ideal to make that about 4 inches longer because that foam is actually foam that came up from underneath. So ideally, if I was doing it again, I would do this another 3 or 4 inches here and come all the way out, even with that tab. And of course, on the other side, also even here. Okay, I'm going to come back and treat this foam right here. That is necessary, in my opinion, because that will now absorb water, and eventually the water will soak through the foam, and then you have corrosion issues in there. So learn from my mistake there. Just leave that tab a couple inches longer. That's another nice thing about that aluminum is it cuts very easy. So in aircraft shears, you know, heavy duty tin snips, whatever you got, just about everybody has something in their garage they can cut that stuff with. So you can make all kinds of crazy profiles. On the Mark V's in particular, there's a tab right here that you can use to kind of support it on the bottom. I don't attach it on the bottom. I rivet it on the top. And now I have, all right, bear with me as I turn the camera around. So I riveted it from the outside and I overlapped it. So that aluminum comes up this high on the outside. So water will sheen down this way, hit that slope, and come over to my drain here. That's the intent. So there's rivets here stabilizing it. Once you have it foamed and sealed, it's not going to go anywhere. But you know, 3 or 4 rivets across there will hold it in place while you're doing the construction. A note that I've failed to mention so far is before you get to this step, make sure you have all your wiring run. Once the foam is in, it's very difficult to run any new wire. So if you're going to do a backup camera, if you're going to add any circuits that go to the back of the car, make sure you do that before you get to this stage. A side note, as you're wrestling that piece of sheet metal in there or whatever you're using, you could use a rigid plastic or a semi-rigid plastic. Got to be careful those edges. These wires will find their way into getting pinched as you're working with it. So you can tape them or zip tie them up out of the way or do something, but just be careful of all those wires, because even putting the bedsides in, you can pinch those wires. So be careful of those as you're going. Keep that in mind. Trying to find a pinched wire and fix it is not a fun one. For the fuel tank on the Beetles, I usually leave a small corner at the very top here open and run it out this way because the wire naturally comes in this way. On this Mark V, it comes in a little further back, so I just seam sealed the crap out of it around that and left that plastic on it to protect the wiring. So I think we're good there. Once you have that side panel in, then you can seam seal all around. And now you're ready to make some blocking and do some foaming. So I just put a little piece here. You can use a lot of different materials, a little piece of plastic, another piece of aluminum. It doesn't have to be a perfect fit, just something to keep this foam from flopping out. It's overkill to go this high, but it works, and I knew I wasn't going to miss. So I made it even with the bottom of the bed wall. So that top surface is about even. On the Beetle, you don't have to worry about it because you have a brace that comes from the B-pillar support here all the way back to that wheel arch. But on the Jetta and Audi kits, you do not, so you got to just fab something up just enough to hold that foam in so it doesn't drop out. Now, as you notice here, I held my wires up out of the way while I foamed it, thinking I wanted to keep as much of the wires out of the foam as possible, which is a great access point, or 0.4 access. But my problem now is if I decide to shave this foam, the wires are right in my way. I probably would have been better off sticking them down all the way at the bottom where I knew they would be out of the way if I tried to shave this at an angle to drain out. You can shape that foam. You got to treat it if you shape it. And then you can make that water go the direction that you want it to. For example, I definitely need to do a little more back in this corner, because if I did get some water here, it's going to run in and that foam is going to hold it up against that aluminum, and that would not be good. So at a minimum, I'm going to put a little more foam in there and get this a little bit more of a gradient to it. One added note, if you happen to use this same foam, I found that 6 ounces of part A and part B for a total of 12 ounces, once you mix it, stir it, pour it in, I found that gave me the correct volume. So 12 ounces total, but as you're pouring it into your measuring cup, 6 ounces of part A, 6 ounces of part B, and that will give you one pour, and you don't have to do multiple pours then. You can do multiple pours, and that's fine, but the 12 ounce total will get you about this volume. So that's the stage that I'm at now, and I will describe now what I'm going to do next. All right, obviously I need to treat this, so I plan on putting some sealant across the top of that foam and making sure this is all sealed on both sides, right? And if you, so naturally this is what came up as that foam expanded. This was sitting here, and honestly, I might have just left that. That's not bad. It's skimmed over, so it's pretty waterproof. Water won't sit on top of it, but for purposes of the video, I needed to get it out of the way so you could see that little corner that I missed and not miss it yourself. So I cut it off, and now I will treat that area. Okay, here's the next step that I haven't done this before, and I'm copying this from another builder, actually 2 builders. Carl Johnson, Mr. Johnson, by the way, thank you. We had a great discussion about Mark V builds the other day. And there was another guy, I can't remember who the builder was, but credit to them both for coming up with this drain idea. We talked about how that fuel tank is right underneath this. And it's a little bit different between the Beetle and the Jettas, and there's a difference between Mark IVs and Mark Vs. On this Mark V, I was able to find a spot right up in the upper corner, and there was a spot weld here I was able to use as a reference looking from underneath the car to make sure I was looking at the right spot that is clear of the fuel tank. So the fuel tank actually sits right about here. That curve comes right here. So right in this corner, right up against the edge of that seat pan curve, there's a little spot where you can fit a 1/2-inch hose. So there's the one on the other side. I selected 1/2-inch hose because I didn't want to make too big a hole here. And I'm going to put a 1/2-inch hose through there. I put a grommet on so the hose is protected and treated the steel after I cut it. So here sitting up top, upside down, is that forward bed floor panel. So that corner is the forward passenger side, or the forward right corner. I drilled a hole and tapped it, and 100 different ways you could approach this. I used a 1/2-inch thread to 1/2-inch barb
nylon fitting. Actually, the gray plastic is not nylon. It may be ABS. But regardless, I threaded that in and then added some epoxy. Right? And this is 1/2 inch, but remember in plumbing, all 1/2 inches are not created equal. So this 1/2 inch hose, I had to heat it up a little bit to slip it over the barbs, but that is never coming off. And this really is a low load. You know, there's not going to be a lot of torque or anything on here, so you're not worried about making a hugely secure fitting, but you don't want something that comes off and then water drains through. So I put some good grade epoxy around here to, you know, roughed up the aluminum first. So this is threaded in, but that aluminum isn't all that thick thread wise. So I added the epoxy. These are 36 cents for these fittings, and 10 feet of this hose is in the neighborhood of $6. And then the grommets were, I think, $1.50. That was the most expensive part, to find the grommets that would fit that hose nicely. This piece of hose is just in here so I didn't get sealant or foam or something in there. So this, now that I have this built, and I did both sides there, the next step is to put this bed floor panel in and feed that hose down through that grommet, which will hang down past the fuel tank and just drain out to the ground right there. So, you know, that forward edge of the bed, especially on the Jettas that have a little forward rake, water always collects up against this front bed wall. And if you have some leaves and stuff, it may be an issue. You have to keep the bed clean. If you have a tunnel cover or something, that helps. Another option for this, there's 8 million different fittings you could use. From boat applications, a through-hole fitting, like for a bilge, or this happens to be from a live well. These are not terribly expensive. You drill the hole, and this makes a great fastened. I mean, it's not going to go anywhere, and then it's barbed here to put a hose on it. You can get them in different sizes. Of course, you have to get the hose to match. The reason I didn't go for this is simply because of that little lip. So there's going to be that much water in the bed before the water comes over and goes out the drain. Whereas this, which I flush cut once I screwed this in, I flush cut it right across there. And then I plan to take the Dremel and just take that edge off right here. So that's kind of what it looks like. And then I'll cover that when I bed line, but when it's all bed lined, it will blend in and it won't be obtrusive sitting down in the bed. And then of course, for that plan, because I'm doing these drains, then I will seal this and all the seams around the bottom of the forward part of the bed. Okay, so that's my attempt at bed drains. I'll have to be careful with the lightweight hose that I don't kink it as I'm feeding it through, right? Because this line does not line up exactly. My drain actually ends up being here. So I'm gonna put a little Z-bend in that hose, and I have just enough room to do that without kinking the hose. But caution, make sure your hose isn't kinked, because then obviously your drain isn't going to do you any good. You could use a stiffer hose to help prevent that, but the more rigid hoses have a thicker wall, so then your hole has got to be bigger, or you got to use a smaller hole. I was pretty happy with the volume of a 1/2. I think even a 3/8 would be fine. I'm talking about rain draining out, so the amount of rain that falls in the bed. You know, I think a 3/8 drain would be fine. Went with a 1/2 inch thin wall. You could use the reinforced hose. You could use PEX. You could use a lot of different materials. Experiment and see what you like to work with. It's up to you. But I think this is going to work. But like I mentioned, I just got to make sure that I don't put a kink in that as I lower this down. And it'll be tough to see and reach up in there and feed that hose through. I'll be reaching up from back here, reaching up, trying to force that hose to go down through the grommet. A little bit of soapy water will help slide the hose through the grommet because it's a little snug. But I think that pretty well covers all my ideas so far. If you have other ideas, please post them in the comments. Put them on the Smyth Ute tech support page on Facebook. There's a lot of people who discuss this stuff there. Sorry it took me so long to get to one of these. again, it's one of those kind of boring videos of a lot of talking and pointing, describing. But having had several utes and built several utes, you will be surprised at the amount of water that will find its way into here and how little slope it takes for that to be up and leaking into your bed. And as I've said before, that's one of the most disappointing things after finishing the beautiful car, and then it rains and you have water in the cab. It's kind of a heartbreaker. So I wish you all luck in your builds. Questions, comments, better ideas, please post them. Thanks for watching. You all take care.